start shortly.
Order, order. Good morning and welcome to this morning's session of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Our chairman, William Ragg's, absent today, so I'll be taking the chair in his place. Today's session is a pre-appointment hearing for the role of First Civil Service Commissioner. We're very pleased to join you. But Baroness Stuart, could you perhaps introduce yourself for the record, please?
Yeah, I'm Baroness Gisela Stuart of Edgbaston, and I'm here in the capacity of being the preferred candidate for the role of the First Civil Service Commissioner.
Thank you very much, and I think you're known to most of us anyway, but we'll push on with the questions if we may, and I'd like to start. And in your paperwork, you said you discussed the role with Cabinet colleagues before applying, Cabinet Office colleagues, should I say. Did this include members of the government?
No, it didn't. And I said in my submission about the motivation of why I applied, it was coming across the work of the Commission and working with commissioners, and therefore and in my motivation to apply, I discussed it with Cabinet Office officials. I also did talk to I told once I had applied, the previous holder of the office, that I had applied, but these were the only conversations outside of
no conversations with ministers?
Not with ministers, no.
Splendid, thank you. So you weren't asked or encouraged to apply by any members of the government?
Not by members of the government, no. It was a question of that once I inquired of saying, this is something which I think is really important, and you test whether other people think that your skills would match that. And it was in that context I had conversations.
Thank you. The deadline for applications was extended. Did you apply before the deadline was extended or afterwards?
As far as I was aware, the deadline, I think it was which I saw on the website, was the 14th, and my application was dated the 7th, but it was acknowledged, I think, the following Monday.
Right.
So the application went in well within the deadline, and the deadline is something over which I have no control nor any knowledge as to why it seems to have been extended.
And so why do you think you were chosen as the government's preferred candidate? Would you like to perhaps share any observations you may have?
I think it's a role which requires a combination of skills, and no one candidate, I think, will ever meet the entire spectrum of skills which you're looking for. But one thing seems to be becoming clearer is that whilst you need someone who understands the civil service, it is increasingly felt that probably shouldn't be someone who comes from the civil service. Yeah. And if I look back at what I've done over the years, both in commercial, before I entered active political and public life, I was involved in publishing and book selling both here and on the continent, in Germany and the Netherlands. And then was actually a law lecturer and was teaching the law of evidence. And then entered politics where I was a minister, so I had first-hand experience. I then negotiated for 15 months the European Constitution in Brussels, which meant I had to deal with heads of state and government and members of parliament from all political parties across the spectrum. And then having left active politics in 2017, in a sense went behind the scene and working both at Wilton Park and in the Cabinet Office. And I think it gives me some insights of where the tensions arise, but also how you deal with those tensions and always coming back to the bedrock is an impartial civil service that is appointed on merit and open and fair competition.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, then you have a very broad-based level of experience, including direct experience of Whitehall as a minister. I mean, do you have any observations as to where you think some of the tensions might be arising now, given that we're actually heading towards a number of quite significant appointments? We've been through quite a turbulent set of politics. Are there any tensions you're particularly concerned about making sure that the recruitment process addresses?
I think there's some tensions which will always exist, and the ones which will always exist is between the impermanence of the politician, and with that comes the sense of urgency, and the role of a permanent civil service that serves the whole of the United Kingdom and will serve the government of the day, and on occasions has to make it clear to ministers that what they may want to do may not be possible for doing. Within those, there are some tensions which are developing. For example, the speed of change is becoming faster and faster. We are still using data, for example, in order to support the validity of decisions we've made, rather than using data in order to see where future policy interventions may be necessary. These are kind of skills which the civil service traditionally has not attracted. And quite rightly so. If you've got a system which rewards the universalist, the generalist, then it is a perfectly reasonable career not to become too specialist. So I think, but also I think it is important to reflect that the last 5 years have been unusual. And
we hope.
Yes, we hope. And therefore, for a civil service who wishes to serve the government of the day to its best ability, makes it quite tricky when you go through a period where it's, you have one referendum, 2 general elections, 3 prime ministers. So then followed by a pandemic. So the challenge for us is to realize what the important things are for the future and focus on those, but learn from some of the upheaval of the past. And one of the things I think we should really have to learn is how successful the civil service was in bringing teams together under conditions which were really under high pressure and very difficult to predict what would happen next. And what we've learned from that, and then make sure that that gets embedded in the rest of the civil service.
Okay, thank you. David Jones.
Yes, thank you. Baroness Stuart, you've got a lot of public roles at the moment. You're the lead non-executive director for the Cabinet Office. You chair the board of Wilton Park, which is an FCDO agency. You're involved with the Birmingham Business School, Birmingham City University, just to name but a few. Why did you decide to add to your public roles by applying for this particular position?
The public roles which I listed, some of them are exceptionally non-onerous. For example, as president of the Birmingham Bar Choir, I chair the AGM. That is my entire role. But I thought, in the interest of transparency, that I should list all the things which are listed on my register of interest in the House of Lords. That fulfills with the requirement. I was always clear that in applying for this position, the logical consequence of that would be that I would have to give up the Cabinet Office role, which is the one which requires the greatest time commitment. And I have stepped down from that. And if you go on the Cabinet Office website, you will see that a new lead NED has been appointed, and I no longer fulfil that function. In terms of Wilton Park, I chair the board and the advisory council. The last 2 years have been very time-consuming, but we now have a new board, a new chief executive, and a new advisory council, and I think that will be less. And then with all the others, that actually fits in very easily with the commitment. So the major time-consuming, I've given up. I've also stepped down, by the way, from the Henry Jackson Society as a director.
Nevertheless, you're expected to devote 3 days a week to the role of First Civil Service Commissioner. Will you have sufficient time to fulfil all these roles, even after having stepped down from some of them?
I think what I plan to do, for example, some of them are coming to the end, and I have essentially alerted some of them of saying you probably should look for successors, because I think it's always fair that if you step down from a position, that you should help them to find a successor for you. But I'm absolutely clear in my mind that is the main job I do, and I probably assume it will take more than 3 days, but as these things usually do.
You've said that you would recuse yourself from commission business relating to both the Cabinet Office and the FCDO. The terms of the permanent secretaries of both of these departments are due to expire during the time of your proposed tenure in your new role. Given that your primary role is to chair the most senior recruitment panels, wouldn't you actually be recusing yourself from some of the most important tasks of your period of tenure?
I've discussed that with the chief executive on how to manage the conflicts of interest in terms of recusing itself. And it is not without precedent for the first Civil Service Commissioner to recuse himself or herself from the PermSec appointment. And I think the strength of the Commission is that it is 10 other commissioners who would then, one of them would step into that. And it's a depth and breadth of expertise, I think would make sure that the Commission itself is not in any way impeded in fulfilling its proper function.
Would you intend to recuse yourself during the whole period of your tenure, or simply at the beginning?
No, I think the requirement is to recuse myself from the Cabinet Office for 2 years.
Just for 2 years?
As to FCDO, my term at Wilton Park finishes at 2023, and at that point it's the appropriate point to reflect how to best proceed.
You've said you'll step down from the Cabinet Office board, but active participation in the departmental board is a central part of the lead non-executive role. You're also expected to report on board effectiveness. How would you propose to fulfil your responsibilities as lead non-exec if you don't sit on the board?
Sorry, I'm no longer the lead non-exec in the Cabinet Office. No, I would have to be a board member.
Okay.
So my relationship with the Cabinet Office, my formal relationship with the Cabinet Office as a member of the departmental board has completely ceased as of the 31st of January.
I understand. Will you sit on the senior leadership board?
I think it is traditionally that the first Civil Service Commissioner is a member of that, and there have been discussions as to what extent, in previous incumbents, to what extent that is the right thing to do. And my view would be at the early stages you follow what your colleagues have done, and then if on reflection you feel a different course of action is appropriate, then that's what you do then.
That's the sort of role you would see yourself playing there. Would you intervene directly on specific moves?
What kind of specific ones would you have in mind?
Well, such as may arise. I mean, do you feel that there will be any need for you to intervene personally?
It's slightly difficult to comment on a committee which all I know about the committee is its composition. I don't know what kind of discussions they will have. The argument has been amongst think tanks is that whilst it's right for the first Civil Service Commissioner to be part when he talks about strategic talent management, but is it right when it gets into individuals? And again, without actually having first-hand experience as to what I think feels right or not, I think the best starting point is to follow what your predecessor has done.
That seems reasonable. Thank you very much.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Baroness Stuart. We were previously advised, I think, either by the Permanent Secretary or Mr Gove, that one of your responsibilities on the Cabinet Office Board was for the Union, and I wonder if you can tell us what that meant in practice and what you actually achieved in respect of that responsibility.
Yes, what I was always very keen on was an awareness of the Union. That I sometimes, that when ministers, the responsibilities, when they're just English responsibilities. And one of the key things which I thought were essential, that we actually had comparable data on what happens in the four parts of the United Kingdom, and that they're at such a way that it actually could make comparisons, but more keenly, that we can learn from best practice from others as well. So, for example, the COVID response was something which went through Cabinet Office, and why did rollout of COVID in Wales at some stage really work successfully and quite fast? What had they done? I also think that the exchange of civil servants between devolved administrations and Whitehall is very important. That is actually a mutual understanding. And I have to say, I thought it was very good that when I talked to previous civil service commissioners and their experience of appointing perm-secs for both Wales and Scotland, is that the emphasis was always on finding the best. So my role in the Cabinet Office was really ensuring awareness, comparative data, and a responsiveness to that sometimes things have to be differently, and also an awareness for Whitehall that sometimes things are done better somewhere else, and we can learn from each other.
And did those considerations lead you to reflect on whether the concept of one civil service within Great Britain is actually sustainable? Because we're in a position where civil servants, for example, in Scotland are asked to take forward policies which are directly contrary to the policies of the United Kingdom government, for example, the holding of an independence referendum.
I think what it led me to conclude is that the one civil service was even more important than I probably had thought before, because what the civil service has shown, that its ability of impartiality means that it is able to work with administrations of different political parties. And the relationships between the civil servants at a UK-wide level are actually very helpful and very supportive. And both the Scottish Permanent Secretary and the Welsh Permanent Secretary have just been recently recruited. And when I look at the number of Director General and Director level, I think in future that exchange and that one service and learning from each other is absolutely vital for the success of all component parts. So my conclusion of working with that was that it's absolutely essential, I think, for the fabric of democracy in the United Kingdom to operate.
Now, this role hasn't been held by a politician since 1909, and you're quite an interesting politician, because recently when I was suffering from COVID, I watched a replay of the 1997 general election, and you were the poster girl, really, for that New Labour success in that election, with one of the earliest results coming through on election night. What's your journey been from election night 1997 to the 3rd of February 2022?
Well, it's even more poignant that when you come into the committee room, you see a picture of Neville Chamberlain on the wall, and the socialist politician born near Munich takes the seat of Neville Chamberlain, who was the Member of Parliament for Birmingham Edgbaston in 1938. So I think what my political career has shown, or I hope has shown, that I actually have a firm belief on things which are right. And that I try to make the argument for what is right. And when that sometimes means that you have to go against the flow, then you have to do so. And I think an independence of mind, even when it's not comfortable, is probably something I hope I've shown in the last 20 years. In terms of that question of the politician occupying the role, it's interesting going back to the statute, the Act of Parliament, because I I think that's, if you look at the Civil Service Commission as it is today, that's its foundations of what is defined in the Act. And whilst serving members of Parliament are specifically excluded, actually, if you go back to the debates when the Act was passed, there was never any discussion further than that just members of Parliament. And if you look at the terms of reference for public bodies, there's a recognition that peers have a significant contribution to make to public life. And I entered the House of Lords in 2019 as a non-affiliated, and the conveners of the crossbenches are quite keen that they want to be satisfied that they only allow you to join the crossbenches once you have given up party political ambitions. And I joined the crossbenches in last year in September, and so that really has been my journey, one from public life at some stage, but in a party political role, to one of public life which is not party political.
And how confident are you that you could be and will be perceived as independent of government? Because there might be some malevolent voices, for example, who might suggest that your support for Brexit has made you more amenable to appointment by this government.
I think that trust is always established by transparency in your actions and but also a consistency in your actions. So you have to, whenever faced with a problem, you analyse the principles, you make it clear the principles on which you base your decisions, and you leave a track record of how you arrived at that. And I think in terms of the Commission, on occasions when the first Civil Service Commissioner will have to make those decisions, it's you work with the rest of the Commission, you've got clear processes, and that's how people will have confidence in what you do. And I hope I will be able to demonstrate that.
During your term of office, if appointed, there is likely to be a general election, and obviously whilst I and my colleagues wouldn't wish to see a change of government, that's not impossible. How do you think your appointment would be received by a different party in government?
Well, the Act of Parliament makes it quite clear that this is an independent position, and therefore it's a 5-year limited term. And I would hope that whatever government is in power, they would be satisfied that the Commission is fulfilling its role in ensuring fair appointment processes based on merit, irrespective of which government it is. And in part of your earlier question, Mr. Mundell, it's the way the Commission already works with governments of different political parties in Scotland and in Wales. It shows that that is an aspiration which is achievable, and my predecessors have achieved, and I hope to do the same.
Thank you very much.
Ronnie Cowan.
Good morning. I'm curious about a couple of points made there. You've been... It's just a bit of impartiality, which is incredibly difficult if you've got strong views on something, yeah? And I've heard what you've said, but you do have very strong views on things. And you must find yourself in a position of conflict where you're trying to support cabinet ministers, trying to support the civil service, but you've got your own particular views about things. You've been very strong in your support when Douglas Ross was appointed leader of the Scottish Conservative parties. You came out and said this is a good thing, and a good thing for the union. But how does that fit in with, as was mentioned earlier on, the Scottish Parliament saying we want to push for a referendum?
The last time I was in front of this committee was actually it was a remote meeting, and it was on an independent commission on the conduct of referendums. And you will have found on that occasion that Dominic Grieve and I were in total agreement on what processes and procedures you should put in place if you had a future referendum. It is perfectly possible, and actually I think it is desirable, that if you have strong views about what should be done, however, there are means of how it should be done. And I think it is the function of the civil service to test, and the commissioner when the appointments are, to test whether the people who are given a particular task, whether they actually have the skills to fulfill that task. So if you were to say I had a classic example when I was a health minister, where I had exceptionally strong views about a review on transplants, heart, lung, liver transplants. There was a review. I was a health minister, and one of my hospitals was on the threat of that unit. At that moment, you go and you say, how can we make sure I have absolutely no say in that decision? You put the processes in place. So whatever Scotland decides, whatever the First Minister decides, the role of the First Civil Service Commissioner is to ensure that when there are processes of appointment, the most capable, depending on the job description which has agreed, are appointed on a fair and open competition.
So is it right and proper of you to describe Douglas Ross as an ace up the sleeve and a powerful weapon against the breaking of the union, when, as we now know, the view from the hierarchy within the Conservative Party is that he's lightweight?
I think that as First Civil Service Commissioner, that is not a question that would have any influence on when senior civil servants are appointed for a position in the Scottish Government. My relationship with the Scottish Government would be one of agreeing on the job description and making sure that the process is conducted fairly. And indeed, I would regard it to be one of the, with this committee's approval, one of the very first things would be to visit both Wales and Scotland and meet with the PERMSEC and with First Ministers.
Let's move on to civil service recruitment then. The Constitutional Reform and Governance Act requires the First Civil Service Commissioner to protect the impartiality of the civil service. What do you understand by civil service impartiality?
I think that it supports the government of the day and enables them to achieve their policies. And I think the statement on government reform is quite clear, that which was a joint statement between the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister, that the impartiality of the civil service actually serves them best. And the impartiality is one that they speak truth when things are possible and when things are not possible. I think the impartiality also has to be underpinned by skills and ability to do the job. And therefore I think the recruitment principles are something where you may want to revisit in terms of whether it still embraces the principles required from the civil service, but I don't think in any sense they undermine the impartiality.
You think ministers understand that?
I think it will vary from minister to minister, but the key thing is that you, both in your conduct but also in the reminder, have clear rules which you remind ministers of. And one of the things which are a slight problem is that sometimes system appears so impenetrable, particularly when you have recruitment from outside, that some more streamlining of how the rules work, that they're more transparent and probably more consistent, is really important.
In your written answers to our questions, you list one of your priorities as improving recruitment practice in line with the Declaration on Government Reform. Excuse me. The Declaration emphasises the need for ministerial visibility of senior civil service appointments. What do you understand by ministerial visibility of appointments, and what, in your view, is the appropriate level of ministerial involvement in senior recruitment?
At the moment, ministers are more involved in PERMSEC and Director General involvement, and with directors it's a lesser degree, and they're given a list of merit, and if ministers want to question that, the entire board of the Commission would have to be consulted. from what I have seen is that the real key is when you draft the job description, and then when you go out to advertisement and make sure that you have got a real balanced competitive field. And therefore I would have, from my experience so far of having worked with commissioners on boards, but also having talked to predecessors of first civil service commissioners and previous cabinet secretaries, it is the greatest is the ministerial involvement. The most important one is that job description stage, when you say what is it you're looking for, and once you've agreed on that, it is then the commission's role to find the right person on what they're looking for.
I'm interested in this. You said about writing the job description. Surely the job descriptions are already in place, or are they being reviewed on a constant basis? And who does that? What sort of change would we make? Because it's a changing, evolving world, obviously. So they must evolve.
Yeah. So let me give you one very specific example. Okay. There are job descriptions as to what you expect the permanent secretary to do, what the director general does, and the director does. If you were, for example, at the moment to look at recruiting for a department which deals with trade negotiations following our decision to leave the European Union, you are talking about an activity, i.e. dealing with trade negotiations, with the United Kingdom Civil Service has not been involved in for the last 40 years. And therefore, you have to bring together a team of people. So what you're looking for in your director to supplement what the Director General and the rest of the team have is actually important, that their support, and therefore it comes in that job description where I think you have to be clear on what it is you're looking for. It is how do you assemble the most effective group of people to do a particular job of the government of the day.
You've scared me. Who's doing that job now?
Which particular job?
The trade agreements.
Yeah, that team, and as you need new people, they have got a team, but as you recruit new people to that, that's the kind of thing you were looking for. I was trying to give you an example of an area of policy where the job description is actually really important because you're doing something new.
You just seem to be implying that we hadn't been doing this for 40 years, so suddenly we had to find people in post who are capable of doing it.
Well, trade negotiations were EU competence, and therefore member states did not do their own trade negotiations.
We were involved. We were involved.
It is the analogy I always draw is, you know how different it is from being a committee member to chairing a committee. So we have been committee members for the last 40 years, but we hadn't had much experience of chairing the committee.
As you say, impartiality is very important. You described the Declaration on Government Reform as a powerful statement of what we need to do as a country to lead our recovery equal in scale and ambition to any post-war recovery. As a Cabinet Office non-executive, what involvement, if any, did you have in the development of the Declaration?
I saw an early draft, that was all, and then I saw the final declaration. But I didn't have an input. No.
What would happen if you saw the final declaration? Did you, at that point, just say, or could you have stepped in and changed it? Did you have an influence on it, or was it just a case of being informed about it?
No, I think it would have been inappropriate for members of the Cabinet Office Board to be involved. That is policy, whereas the board's function is actually much more strategic. And quite frankly, I would regard that declaration, I would read that in conjunction with a speech given not much later by the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. And I mean, I don't know whether you're going to come on to that, but I think it is important at that moment to remind ourselves that we are facing, on the one hand, enormous changes, but on the other hand, if you're the next generation that comes up that is actually looks for trust in things, looks for has a sense of social responsibility, has a sense of public service, the next decade is enormously exciting in shaping the future. And I think the civil service in attracting the best and the brightest actually has to convey a sense, or more of a sense of that we will use your skills and we will give an opportunity to do the best for your country. And I think that the declaration did capture some of that.
So looking at the reforms of the civil service, what do you think the responsibility of the first Civil Service Commissioner is with regard to implementing a government's proposed reforms of the civil service?
Which particular reforms were you thinking of?
Any reforms. When you're in the job of the first Civil Service Commissioner, must have a view and must have a role in that, or does have a view and does have a role in that?
I think the first Civil Service Commissioner has a role in ensuring that the rules which any decisions which are made are properly applied. And I mean, for example, one of the things which I would hope we can move to is that at the moment all PermSec and all Director General positions are open competitions by external competitions by default, but not at director level. I would hope that we can move that the same applies to the director level. The reason for that is that I think the more we can ensure that we attract the skills into the civil service and allow them to deliver their best, the more we take away this notion that we always have to turn to the private sector. It's an interchange to move in and to move out. So these are one of the things I would certainly argue for. I would also really look and argue for that once you move to get a position where you may require a new cabinet secretary, that process is more open and transparent in line with the recruitment of a permanent secretary. So these are the kind of internal reforms. If ministers, as a policy decision, then you're a regulator.
Do you envisage rewriting the recruitment principles during your term?
There's a statutory process if you want to review them, and the last time they reviewed and reformed were in 2018, and I think a significant credit should go to Ian Walkmore for that review, because it was bringing into employment, government into employment, so care leavers, ex-offenders. It made extra exemptions to allow people to come in. I think there is a case to look at them again, not least because the Declaration of Government Reform sort of charges the first the Civil Service Commission to attract more people with a science and data background. I also would have thought that with this recognition that you need greater movement between Whitehall and the devolved administrations and a continuous involvement. But the statutory provision at the moment say that the only consultation is a very limited consultation if you wanted to reword those principles. I would look to a wider engagement in order to do that, because I think the more you can involve people in making those decisions, the more embed that the principles and values which underpin those decisions have a wider ownership.
Thank you very much.
Randall.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry. Could I just come back to David first then?
Yes,
my mistake.
Thank you. The process for appointing a cabinet secretary is less clearly defined than the processes for appointing permanent secretaries, and this committee has taken evidence on a previous occasion from the previous First Civil Service Commissioner, who told us that he had attempted to regularise the process of appointing a new cabinet secretary, including a job description, inviting applications from serving and former permanent secretaries, an initial sift with independent input, and interviews conducted by the Prime Minister. Do you think that that was a sensible proposal? And if you are appointed, would you implement that process, or would you want to devise a variation or an alternative process?
I think this particular appointment is a sort of running theme for first civil service commissioners, because the very first conversation I had with Usha Prashar, who was a civil service commissioner before David Normington, and then in Whatmore, we had conversations about that process of the job descriptions and how you go through that. I think that because of the rather unusual circumstances of the last recruitment, because in previous cases it is the outgoing cabinet secretary who plays a role in the appointments process, and of course this didn't happen the last time. What Ian Whatmore achieved, I think, is establish some principles which sounded to me very sound and very reasonable. And I would expect, I think I would find it hard anybody to argue against what he has established, and I would certainly hope that we can build on what he's done. I went back and actually made a note, because what he suggested to you, he said, agree a job description and potential candidate pool. Offer potential applicants a chance to express their interest in the role, which I think is really important. The first Civil Service Commission undertakes initial review of the applicant's paperwork and proceed to assess suitability and make recommendations. And the Prime Minister to interview and meet candidates with, and this is an important process bit, with either the first Civil Service Commissioner and maybe a senior NED before making the final choice. I do not think that these ought to be seen as onerous obligations. I think it seems to me a process that becomes more transparent, more predictable, and more open.
Would you actually see yourself performing any active role in the recruitment process for the next Cabinet Secretary?
As Ian Whatmore described it, yes, I would.
Even though you've recused yourself from Cabinet Office business?
I think it would be, if it was within 2 years, then I would have to use one, rely on one of the other commissioners. Or I think it would depend on the conditions. I think this is one of the questions where really you would turn to propriety and ethics. You would turn to the chief executive of the commission and take the appropriate advice as to whether it is right or not.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chair. Baroness Stuart, you've listed increasing diversity in the senior civil service as one of your main priorities for your term. What practical steps do you propose to take to increase that diversity?
Can I... forgive me if I now sound like a politician and redefine the question, but I'm slightly worried when diversity is seen in too narrow. I think what I look for, and I think Ian Whatmore, again in his report, talks about cognitive diversity. Actually, what we're looking for is people who bring different skills, bring different ways of thinking, bring different ways of approaching a problem. And the Civil Service Commission, if you look at the record, has a good track record in terms of applications from female applications. When it comes to ethnic minorities, in a sense, the trajectory of a number of applications leading to interviews, leading to appointments, is not a very good one, and more work needs to be done. But I think at that level it is working with departments on the pipeline, that as the recruits are coming up and the skills base. But I would also say that, and it comes back to the feeling about job descriptions in a sense, do we recognise different skills which people bring in a way which is then rewarded? Let me give you one very practical example. There's currently a review on language skills across the civil service. And it's very easy to measure people who have got a degree level on foreign languages. But do we recognise heritage languages? Do we actually recognise the population that is grows up speaking two languages? At the moment, we don't. And do we take that into account? And I think I would also want more regional diversity to look for, because of bringing different life experiences and different approaches. And what is right to be done in the southeast of England may not be the appropriate approach to something in Scotland or in the Midlands or in Wales. And I would look for an expectation that the civil service, as you move high up the grades, will have had experience in various settings. And that is one way where I think you increase diversity of cognitive diversity as well as diversity of backgrounds.
So how we define diversity might vary slightly, and there's different aspects to it. But if we take, for example, the representation of, as you've identified, ethnic minority staff or staff with disabilities, that is sort of lower in the senior civil service than it is in the population at large, and actually increasing the sort of level of increase for people with those characteristics has increased, but it's still lagging behind the sort of general population. Do you have anything to suggest how that might be improved?
Where I've seen really good practice is when departments work with agencies to bring on their leadership programs, to actually intervene and ensure that the promotion and progression is actively managed. And I think that's how the representation of women has in a sense been achieved. And I would expect departments to do similarly with... You're quite right to remind me that the record on disability isn't very good. But can I come back to the role of the first civil service, or the commission, the first civil service commissioner? It's a regulator that should encourage and promote best practice and point out when best practice is not being fulfilled. And that's why I think the initiative in the bringing into employment and sponsoring that in other departments was important. But it should show support and help, and in a sense hold up a mirror when things aren't working well. And then I think you embed it in the departments. And on that level, I think there's still a fair amount of extra work to be done. You're right.
And you've said, and looking at sort of the different types of diversity that there is out there, you've said as a priority, you've listed increasing the number of senior civil servants being recruited from and working outside of London and across the 4 nations. And then you've got the sort of current protected characteristics in the Equality Act. How do you sort of balance that geographical diversity, or the pursuit of that, with the sort of traditional, as it were, protected characteristics? Is retention there, or is that a difficult one to balance, do you think?
I think it's difficult if you want it to be difficult. I think the approach has to be that you say we will simply have to balance that. It's an area where you see. I grew up in Bavaria, which is highly devolved. I grew up in Germany, which is a highly devolved country, where there isn't an expectation that in order to make it in the world you have to leave the place you were born in. And I think my aspiration is in many ways that if you want to be in the civil service, if you want to contribute to the well-being of your country, that you should be able to do that in Darlington, you should do that in Liverpool, you should do that anywhere. And at the moment we've had still too much of a pull, and that whatever rules apply in the current system, whether it is have to apply across the country, and it is a question of will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. The Commission is responsible also for the Civil Service Code, and that's sort of very relevant this week as we've had the interim update from Sue Gray, which highlights some rather worrying behaviours. And one of her findings is that some officials who were uncomfortable with what was going on in number 10 of the Cabinet Office didn't feel that they were able to raise any concerns. And I'd just like to invite your reflections on that, on what you can do to encourage people to actually feel comfortable in bringing forward complaints and issues and upholding the code more generally.
Yeah, and I was looking at the key facts in the annual report on how many breaches of the code and how many appeals were received by the Commission. And this suggestion of, at what level should the confidence to either whistleblow or complain happen? I think the Civil Service Commission has an overarching role in the number of complaints which come to them. But the function after that is, to me, success is that in each department, people are comfortable to raise that within their department. The compliance with the code isn't something which you park and say, oh, this commission needs to look after that. You have the commission, you've got the propriety and ethics to be that sort of final stop for that umbrella. But the real task is you've got to really drill it down, because the observance of that code has to be, and an awareness of the code has to be at every level when you enter the civil service, in every grade which comes up. And one of the things which the Commission identified is that when you had the staff survey questions, there isn't even sufficient awareness of the code, and the trajectory of that was actually slightly downwards. And I think that's where the Commission has a special responsibility and ought to interact more. And it does, so just as it does special workshops for recruitment principles for departments, I think if I'm allowed to take up the position, I would want to take a good look at what is being done and what more can be done. But ultimately, success is that everyone feels within their department the structures are in place to whistleblow or complain, and that it is handled properly, rather than think the answer is to move it somewhere else.
That's very encouraging. And I take you back to your opening comments, really, where you articulated the principles behind and the values that underpin our civil service extremely well. And for me, I think behaviour is central to that, and the integrity and objectivity which we expect civil service to bring. And that includes compliance with appropriate rules and standards. What you've just said to me there about the role of the staff survey would suggest that actually the awareness of those standards of behaviour which we take for granted as being embedded in the civil service seems to be diminishing, and perhaps that's playing out in some of the instances where we're now witnessing. But you just said that if that is something which would be of interest to you. But to what extent do you think the Commission ought to be more proactive in driving that, as opposed to the Cabinet Office structure or indeed ministers?
You also raised something which is quite interesting, that because at the moment it's honesty, integrity, objectivity and impartiality, which are quite passive concepts. And when you talk to Gus O'Donnell, he always talked about the 4 Ps, which were pace, profession, pride and passion. And I sometimes think that whether the awareness is one that it's sort of slightly less easy to relate what it means to comply with them. I've seen the slide. I asked for the slide which civil servants, when they join, and what's the first introduction to the Civil Service Code, and maybe going back to some of the way you phrase it, and I thought Gus O'Donnell actually did that rather well. But I think this is something where, at the moment, I have not yet had the first-hand experience of how to do it inside, and it'd be also something where, if you as a committee felt there was something which we ought to do differently, I'd be very happy to come back to relate to you how on reflection I think we might be able to embed it even more, and any thoughts the committee may have.
Thank you. And this is rather more a political question, but I just invite, it is actually relevant to how you apply recruitment principles. We're still essentially working on a civil service model which was created in 1854, Northcote Trevelyan. As you said, it's the cult of the generalist as opposed to the specialist. And we know that the kind of commercial and managerial skills that you need in the 21st century aren't necessarily seen as the way to advance your career in the civil service. There's still very much a prejudice towards policy, if you like. And you highlighted at the beginning, the pandemic and how that's challenged our processes. And the example that when you refer to data, that we tend to use it as a justification rather than a way of looking forward, I thought was very instructive, because again it comes back to the fact that one of the things that the way the civil service functions at the moment is it's brilliant at process. So it stepped up to the challenge in terms of getting things done, but that forward-looking and more commercial discipline that's missing, just how do we get that? Can we actually do that through recruitment and through the leadership positions and just applying those, or do we need to actually really challenge the whole generalist concept more than we have to date?
If you go back to Northcote Trevelyan, I mean, there was sometimes sort of summarise it of what was wrong up to that point is that you appointed your nephew, and your nephew didn't know how to do the job. So there were two things you needed to do: is did you have people who were competent, and were the processes by which you appoint them were open and transparent, and that's why your open and fair competition and merit comes in. And I think we have made really some significant progress in over the years on the openness and the processes. The question then is, have we got it right what we measure as merit? And if we reward the senior civil service for its generalist skills, they will acquire generalist skills. And if if you have a system where promotion is depending on moving up grades, and that's the only way you can do it, then that is the system. And if we want that to change, I think we should not blame the civil service for that. I think it's the markers and the conditions which we set. But I also want to make an observation about what the pandemic also showed is rules and structures and transparency and clarity of the rules and structures. They are the really important thing when things are tough. That's when you need them. When things go well, then there is greater flexibility and all those things. But the structures of the civil service, the direct lines of accountability, what it has told us, what the pandemic should have told us, is just how important that system is. And I think it is fundamental to a functioning democracy. It may be a long-established principle, but I think it is a core principle for democracies.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any further questions? No? Well, thank you very much. That's been a very interesting hour. We'll end today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Order, order.